The boy whispered, "Mommy can't walk anymore." What this cowboy did changed all their lives. On a desolate highway stretching through the heart of Texas, a stranger in a worn cowboy hat notices something that most would drive past without a second glance. A broken-down sedan, a woman slumped against the hood, and a small boy with tears streaking through the dust on his face. What begins as a simple act of kindness unravels into a journey that will test the boundaries of sacrifice, reveal the hidden scars both carry, and ultimately rewrite the meaning of family. This is not just a story of rescue. This is a story of souls finding each other in the wreckage of their separate storms. If this story moves you, please hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. The sun hung low over the Texas plains like a burning eye, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked asphalt as if the earth itself were reaching for something it had lost. The highway was empty, a ribbon of faded gray cutting through fields of dried grass that whispered secrets to the wind. In the distance, heat shimmered and danced, creating mirages of water that vanished the moment you believed in them. It was the kind of afternoon that felt suspended in time, where nothing moved except the occasional tumbleweed and the thoughts that grew heavier with each passing mile. James Dalton drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the open window frame, his calloused fingers tapping in absent rhythm against the hot metal. His truck was old, reliable in the way that only things built with honest labor could be, and it carried him forward with a steady hum that filled the silence he had grown accustomed to. The cowboy hat on his head was stained with years of sweat and sun. The brim curved just enough to shade eyes that had seen too much and said too little. There was a heaviness in those eyes, a weight that settled there after his daughter had stopped calling, after the divorce papers were signed, after he realized that being a good man and being a present one were not always the same thing. He didn't think about it most days. He had learned to keep moving, to let the road carry him away from the memories that clawed at the edges of his mind when the silence grew too loud. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a tightness in his chest that he couldn't name, as if the world were holding its breath and waiting for something to break. He told himself it was just the heat, just the long hours behind the wheel, but deep down, in the part of him that still listened to instinct over reason, he knew better. That's when he saw it. A car on the shoulder of the road, its hood propped open like a wounded animal, exposing its insides to the merciless sun. At first, it was just another shape in the distance, another broken thing left behind by someone who couldn't fix it. But as he drew closer, he noticed the woman leaning against the driver's side door, her head tilted back, one hand pressed to her forehead, as if trying to hold herself together through sheer will. And then he saw the boy. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, standing a few feet away from the car with his small hands balled into fists at his sides. His face was streaked with tears that had carved clean lines through the dust on his cheeks, and his eyes were fixed on his mother with a look that James recognized instantly. The look of someone watching the person they loved most in the world fall apart and not knowing how to stop it. The boy's lips moved, forming words that James couldn't yet hear, but he didn't need to. He knew that look. He had seen in the mirror once, a lifetime ago, when he was the one watching someone slip away. James pressed his foot on the brake, and the truck slowed to a crawl before coming to a stop a few yards behind the broken sedan. The engine's hum faded into the silence of the plains, and for a moment, he just sat there, his hands still gripping the wheel, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't even glanced in his direction, as if she were too exhausted to care who might be watching. The boy, however, had noticed. His small head turned toward the truck, and their eyes met through the dusty windshield. There was something in that gaze that reached across the distance and pulled at something deep inside James, a recognition perhaps, or a silent plea that transcended words. The boy's lips were pressed together tightly, as if he were trying very hard not to cry anymore, but his eyes betrayed him. They were wide and desperate, the eyes of a child who had learned too early that the world was not always kind, that the people you love could break just as easily as old machinery left out in the sun. James opened the door and stepped out into the heat, feeling it hit him like a physical force. The air was thick and dry, carrying with it the scent of sun-baked earth and gasoline. He adjusted his hat and walked toward them slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder with a rhythm that felt deliberate, careful, as if he were approaching something fragile that might shatter if he moved too quickly. The woman looked up as he approached, and James saw the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, but she wore her weariness like someone twice her age. Her clothes were wrinkled and stained with sweat, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail that had come half undone in the heat. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her lips were chapped and pale. But it was her hands that told the real story. They trembled as she pushed herself off the car, and James noticed the way she gripped the door frame for support, as if standing upright required more strength than she had left. "Need some help, ma'am?" James asked, keeping his voice low and steady, the way you might speak to a frightened animal. The woman blinked at him, as if she were processing his words through a fog. For a moment, he thought she might tell him to leave, might wave him off with the kind of stubborn pride that comes from not wanting to admit you can't do it alone. But then her shoulders sagged, and something in her expression crumbled. I don't know what's wrong with it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just stopped, and I can't." She trailed off, her gaze drifting down to the ground as if the rest of the sentence were too heavy to carry. James nodded and walked over to the open hood, peering inside at the engine. He didn't need to look long to see the problem. A snapped serpentine bell hung limp among the metal and rubber, a simple fix under normal circumstances, but not out here, not without the right tools or a spare part. He straightened up and glanced back at the woman, then at the boy who had inched closer, his small frame casting a shadow that barely reached James's boots. "Belt's gone," James said. "Won't be going anywhere without a new one." The woman closed her eyes and drew in a shaky breath. "Of course," she murmured, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was just the latest in a long line of things that had gone wrong. "Of course it is." The boy tugged on her sleeve, and when she looked down at him, James heard the words that would stay with him long after this day had ended. "Mommy can't walk anymore," the boy whispered, his voice small and cracked, as if he had been holding those words inside for too long and they had finally broken free. The woman's face twisted with something that looked like pain and shame mixed together, and she placed a hand on the boy's head, smoothing down his hair with trembling fingers. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, and James could see the lie in the way her knees buckled slightly, in the way she had to brace herself against the car to stay upright. James felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement of old walls beginning to crack. He didn't know these people. He didn't know them anything. He could have told them about the town 15 miles up the road, could have offered to call a tow truck when he got back into cell range, could have done the bare minimum and still called it kindness. But the boy's words echoed in his mind. "Mommy can't walk anymore." And he thought about all the times he had walked away when he should have stayed, all the moments he had let slip through his fingers because he told himself it wasn't his responsibility, it wasn't his place. "Where are you headed?" he asked. The woman hesitated, glancing down at the boy and then back at James. "Dallas," she said quietly. "My sister lives there. She said we could stay with her for a while, until we figure things out." James nodded slowly. Dallas was hours away, too far for a tow truck to be practical, too far for them to walk even if the woman had been in perfect health. He looked at the boy again, at the way he stood so close to his mother, as if his small body could somehow hold her up, and he made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. "I can take you," he said. The woman's eyes widened. "What? No, I couldn't." "You can," James interrupted gently. "I'm headed that direction anyway. Got space in the truck." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that didn't hurt anyone, the kind that made the world a little softer around the edges. The woman stared at him for a long moment, as if searching his face for some sign of ulterior motive, some hidden danger. But James had long ago stopped being the kind of man who inspired fear. He was just tired, just worn down by the same winds that had carved the canyons into the earth. And maybe she saw that, because eventually she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, and there were tears in her eyes now, the kind that came from relief mixed with the exhaustion of holding yourself together for too long. James helped her gather what little they had, 2 small duffel bags and a child's backpack covered in cartoon dinosaurs, and loaded them into the bed of his truck. The boy climbed into the back seat without being asked, his small hands gripping the edge of the door as he pulled himself up, and the woman followed more slowly, wincing with each movement. James noticed the way she favored her left leg, the way she held her side as if something inside were hurting, and he wondered how long she had been pushing through pain without telling anyone. As he pulled back onto the highway, the broken sedan growing smaller in the rearview mirror, James felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a familiar coat. He didn't know what he was walking into, didn't know what had led this woman and her son to this place, to this moment. But he knew that some things couldn't be ignored, that some cries for help were silent, and that made them no less urgent. The boy sat in the back seat with his face pressed against the window, watching the world roll by in a blur of browns and golds. His mother sat beside him, her head leaning back against the headrest, her eyes closed but her breathing shallow and uneven. James drove in silence, the road stretching out before him like a thread pulling him forward into something he couldn't yet name. And somewhere in the spaces between the miles, in the quiet hum of the engine and the soft whisper of wind through the cracked window, the first seeds of transformation were planted, seeds that would grow in the darkness and break through the soil when the time was right. The miles passed slowly, measured not in distance, but in the subtle shifts of light as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The landscape remained largely unchanged. Endless fields, occasional clusters of trees that looked like they were clinging to life by sheer stubbornness, and the ever-present sky that stretched so wide it felt like you could fall up into it if you weren't careful. James kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over questions he didn't dare ask aloud. In the back seat, the boy had stopped watching out the window. Instead, he had pulled a small toy car from his pocket, a battered red convertible with one wheel missing, and was rolling it slowly across his knee, making soft engine sounds under his breath. It was a quiet game, the kind children play when they've learned that silence is safer than noise, when they've been taught by circumstance to take up as little space as possible. James glanced at him in the rearview mirror and felt something tighten in his chest. The woman, she had introduced herself as Sarah, though she had offered nothing more than a first name, had drifted into a fitful sleep. Her head lolled to one side, and every so often she would flinch as if her dreams were unkind. James could see the tension in her face even in sleep, the way her brow furrowed and her lips pressed together as if she were arguing with someone only she could see. He wondered what kind of battle she was fighting behind her closed eyes, what kind of weight she carried that made even rest look like labor. "Is my mom going to be okay?" The question came so quietly that James almost missed it. He glanced in the mirror again and found the boy looking directly at him, his eyes large and serious, far too serious for someone so young. "She's resting," James said carefully, measuring his words. "That's good. She needs it." The boy considered this for a moment, then went back to his toy car, but James could see the doubt lingering in his expression. Children had a way of knowing when adults were telling them comfortable lies instead of hard truths. They could feel the tremor of uncertainty beneath reassuring words, could sense when the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as the grown-ups pretended it was. "My name's Ethan," the boy said after a while. "Good to meet you, Ethan. I'm James. Are you a real cowboy?" James allowed himself a small smile. "Depends on what you mean by real. I work with horses sometimes. Fix things. Drive a lot. Do you have a lasso?" "Used to. Gave it to my daughter when she was about your age." The words came out before James could stop them, and he felt the familiar ache that always followed any mention of Emma. She would be 15 now, nearly grown, living a life 3 states away with her mother and a stepfather who probably took her soccer games and helped with homework and did all the things James had failed to do when it mattered most. "Where is she now?" Ethan asked, his voice innocent and curious. "She's with her mom," James said, and left it at that. Some truths were too complicated to explain to a 6-year-old, too tangled in regret and missed opportunities to fit into simple sentences. They drove for another hour before Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly as if she were surfacing from deep water. She looked around, momentarily disoriented, before her gaze landed on Ethan and something in her expression softened. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice rough. "Not long," James replied, which was another small kindness wrapped in vagueness. "There's a rest stop coming up in about 10 miles. Figure we could stretch our legs, get some water." Sarah nodded, but didn't say anything else. She reached over and placed a hand on Ethan's knee, a gesture that seemed both protective and reassuring, as if she needed to confirm he was still there, still safe. Ethan covered her hand with his smaller one and gave her a smile that tried so hard to be brave that it nearly broke James's heart. The rest stop was a tired collection of buildings set back from the highway, a gas station with pumps that had seen better decades, a small convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights, and a cluster of picnic tables under a metal awning that provided minimal shade. James pulled into a parking spot and killed the engine, and for a moment they all just sat there, adjusting to the sudden stillness after so many miles of motion. James got out first and opened the back door for Ethan, who hopped down with the kind of energy that only children seem to possess, even after hours in a confined space. Sarah moved more slowly, accepting James's offered hand as she eased herself out of the truck. He felt how cold her fingers were despite the heat, noticed the way she had to pause and steady herself before taking a step, and he knew without being told that something was very wrong. "There's a restroom inside," James said, gesturing toward the building. "I'll grab some water and snacks." Sarah nodded gratefully and took Ethan's hand, the two of them making their way across the parking lot with careful, measured steps. James watched them go, noting how Ethan kept glancing up at his mother, how he adjusted his pace to match hers, and he felt the weight of recognition again, the weight of seeing yourself reflected in someone else's struggle. Inside the convenience store, the air conditioning was broken, and the stale air smelled of old coffee and cleaning chemicals. James moved through the aisles, gathering bottles of water and granola bars, a bag of chips that Ethan might like, and a cheap disposable phone card that probably didn't even work anymore, but seemed like it might be useful. At the counter, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Dolores rang him up without making conversation, and James was grateful for the silence. When he stepped back outside, he found Ethan sitting alone at one of the picnic tables, swinging his legs and humming to himself. The boy looked up as James approached and smiled, but it was a fragile thing, easily broken. "Where's your mom?" James asked, setting the bag of supplies on the table. "She said her tummy hurt," Ethan replied, pointing toward the restrooms. "She told me to wait here." James nodded and handed Ethan a bottle of water and the bag of chips. "Here, you must be hungry." Ethan took them eagerly and tore into the chips with the single-minded focus of a child who had learned not to take food for granted. James sat down across from him and unscrewed the cap on his own water bottle, taking a long drink, and tried to ignore the knot of worry that was tightening in his gut. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The sun continued its slow arc toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. James's eyes kept drifting toward the restroom door, and when 15 minutes had gone by with no sign of Sarah, he stood up. "Stay here," he told Ethan, who nodded and continued eating his chips, oblivious to the tension coiling in James's shoulders. James walked across the parking lot and stopped outside the women's restroom, hesitating. He knocked once, then twice. "Sarah, you okay in there?" No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. "Sarah, I'm coming in if you don't answer." Still nothing. James pushed the door open and stepped inside, his heart pounding. The restroom was small and dingy, with 2 stalls and a sink that dripped steadily. The first stall was empty, but the second was closed, and beneath the gap at the bottom, he could see Sarah's shoes. "Sarah," he heard a sound then, a soft, pained whimper, and he moved quickly, pushing open the stall door. Sarah was on the floor, her back against the wall, One hand pressed to her abdomen and the other braced against the toilet for support. Her face was pale, almost gray, and there was sweat beading on her forehead despite the relative coolness of the tiled room. Jesus, James breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. How long have you been like this? I'm fine, Sarah whispered, but the words were automatic, reflexive, the lie of someone who had been telling it so long they almost believed it themselves. You're not fine, James said firmly but without judgment. We need to get you to a hospital. No. The word came out sharp, edged with panic. No hospitals. I can't. I don't have insurance, and I can't leave Ethan alone and… Hey, James interrupted, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Breathe. Just breathe for a second. Sarah's breath came in short, shallow gasps, and her eyes were wide with fear. Not of him, James realized, but of something much larger, something that had been chasing her long before her car broke down on that empty highway. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of people who were running from things that couldn't be outrun, who carried debts and dangers that followed them like shadows. Listen to me, James said quietly. I don't know what you're running from, and you don't have to tell me. But whatever it is, it's not more important than your life. Ethan needs you alive, not stubborn. Sarah closed her eyes, and tears slipped down her cheeks, cutting through the dust and exhaustion. I can't go back, she whispered. If I slow down, he'll find us. And I can't let that happen. I can't let him take Ethan. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications James didn't need explained. He had seen enough of the world to know that monsters didn't always wear masks, that the most dangerous predators were the ones who wore familiar faces and spoke in voices you once trusted. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Sarah wasn't running from debt or bad luck or simple misfortune. She was running from someone. Okay, James said finally. Okay, no hospital, but we need to get you somewhere you can rest properly. Somewhere safe. There's nowhere safe, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Everywhere I go, he's always just one step behind. I'm so tired, James. I'm so tired of running, of looking over my shoulder, of teaching my son to be afraid of his own father. James felt something crack inside him, a fissure that had been forming for years, finally giving way. He thought about Emma, about the way he had failed her by not being there, by letting pride and stubbornness keep him at a distance when she needed him most. He thought about all the times he had told himself he couldn't fix things that were already broken, couldn't save people who didn't want to be saved. But here was Sarah, here was Ethan, and maybe this time he could do something that mattered. Come on, he said, offering his hand. Let's get you back to the truck, and then we're going to figure this out. Together. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, trustworthiness, maybe, or just the simple proof that he meant what he said. Whatever she found there must have been enough because she took his hand and let him help her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and James steadied her, feeling how fragile she was beneath the layers of determination and fear. They made their way back to the truck slowly, and Ethan jumped up from the picnic table as soon as he saw them, his face lighting up with relief. Mommy, I'm okay, baby, Sarah said, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. Just got a little dizzy. That's all. Ethan looked between her and James could see the wheels turning in the boy's mind, the calculations children make when they're trying to figure out if the adults in their lives are lying to them for their own good. But he didn't challenge his mother, just took her hand and walked beside her back to the truck. As they climbed back inside and James started the engine, he made a decision. Dallas was still hours away, and Sarah needed more than just distance from her past. She needed time to heal, needed a place where she could stop running long enough to catch her breath. And James knew a place. A small town just off the highway, a place where he had friends who didn't ask too many questions and who understood that sometimes people needed to disappear for a while. He didn't tell Sarah about the change in plans right away. He just drove, watching the sun sink lower, watching the shadows grow longer, and thinking about the strange way life had of bringing broken people together, as if the universe itself were trying to build something whole from all the scattered pieces. The town of redemption, a name that James had always found either deeply ironic or profoundly hopeful depending on his mood, appeared on the horizon just as the last rays of sunlight were surrendering to twilight. It was one of those places that existed in the liminal space between thriving and forgotten, a collection of weathered buildings that had seen better days but refused to completely give up. There was a main street lined with shops that opened sporadically, a diner that served breakfast all day, and a motel that charged by the week because nobody ever stayed for just a night. James had spent a summer here once, years ago, working on a ranch that belonged to a man named Thomas Whitaker, an old cowboy who believed in second chances and hard work in equal measure. Thomas had given James a job when he needed one most, had asked no questions about the fresh divorce papers in his glove compartment or the bottle he kept hidden under the truck's seat. He had simply put a hammer in James's hand and pointed at a fence that needed mending. And for 3 months, James had rebuilt not just fences, but something inside himself that he thought had been lost forever. He hoped Thomas was still around, still running the small ranch on the outskirts of town. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had, the only place he could think of where Sarah and Ethan might find temporary refuge without questions or paperwork or the kind of scrutiny that could tip off the wrong people. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, her voice groggy as she looked out at the unfamiliar streets. "A friend's place," James said. "Well, an old friend. I'm hoping he can help." Sarah's expression tightened with worry. "I told you we can't." "I know what you told me," James interrupted gently. "And I'm not taking you anywhere official. This is just off the grid. A place to rest for a night or two while we figure out the next step." Sarah wanted to protest. He could see it in her eyes, the instinct to refuse help, because accepting it meant being vulnerable, meant trusting someone in a world that had given her every reason not to. But exhaustion won out over caution, and she nodded, leaning her head back against the seat and closing her eyes. The ranch was exactly where James remembered it, though it looked smaller somehow, as things from the past often did when revisited. The main house was a single-story structure with a wraparound porch, and behind it stood a barn that leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been caught mid-yawn and never straightened up. There were lights on in the windows, warm and yellow against the gathering darkness, and as James pulled up the gravel drive, he saw a figure emerge from the house. Thomas Whitaker looked older. Of course he did. Years had passed. But he carried himself with the same upright posture, the same deliberate movements of a man who had never wasted energy on unnecessary gestures. His hair was whiter now, his face more lined, but his eyes were sharp as they took in James's truck and its passengers. James killed the engine and stepped out, and for a moment, the two men just looked at each other across the distance of years and unspoken history. "James Dalton," Thomas finally said, his voice carrying the faint rasp of age and cigarettes. "Well, I'll be damned." "Thomas," James replied, relief flooding through him at the lack of hostility in the old man's tone. "It's been a while." "That it has." Thomas's gaze shifted to the truck, to the woman and child visible through the windows. "I'm guessing you didn't drive all the way out here just to reminisce." "No, sir," James admitted. "I'm hoping you might have some space. Just for a few days. They need a place to lay low, and I didn't know where else to go." Thomas studied him for a long moment, and James could feel the weight of that scrutiny, the way the old man's eyes seemed to see past the words to the desperation underneath. Then Thomas nodded once, decisive. "Bring them inside. We'll talk after they're settled." James helped Sarah out of the truck, and she leaned on him more heavily now, the last reserves of her strength finally depleting. Ethan followed close behind, his small hand gripping his mother's jacket, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Thomas held the door open as they approached, and as they passed him, James saw something flicker across the old man's face. Recognition, perhaps, or empathy, the kind that comes from having been broken yourself once and understanding the particular shape of another person's fracture. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and there was a lived-in quality to it that spoke of comfort rather than neglect. Thomas led them through a hallway lined with photographs, black and white images of younger men on horseback, of cattle drives and sunsets, of a life spent under open skies, and into a small guest room at the back of the house. "Bathrooms through there," Thomas said, pointing to a door on the left. "Sheets are clean. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry, and I'll bring some water." "Thank you," Sarah whispered, and her voice was so small, so worn down by gratitude and exhaustion, that James had to look away. Thomas nodded and left, and James helped Sarah sit down on the edge of the bed. She sank into it with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, and for a moment she just sat there, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. "You should rest," James said quietly. "I'll keep an eye on Ethan." "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said, looking up at him with eyes that were red-rimmed and full of something that looked like disbelief, as if she couldn't quite accept that someone had shown her kindness without expecting something in return. "You don't have to," James replied. "Just rest." He guided Ethan out of the room and closed the door softly behind them. In the living room, Thomas had set out a tray with sandwiches and water, and Ethan fell upon the food with the kind of hunger that spoke of missed meals and uncertainty about when the next one would come. James sat down across from him and watched as the boy ate, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly onto his shoulders. Thomas appeared in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand, and gestured for James to join him on the porch. James ruffled Ethan's hair and stood, following the old man outside into the cool night air. The stars were out now, scattered across the sky in brilliant profusion, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that echoed across the plains. "You want to tell me what you've gotten yourself into?" Thomas asked, not unkindly. James leaned against the porch railing and stared out at the darkness. "Found them stranded on the highway. Car broke down. Woman's sick, maybe real sick, and she's running from someone. The boy's father, I think. She's scared, Thomas. Scared enough that she won't go to a hospital even when she can barely stand." Thomas took a sip of his coffee and was quiet for a moment. "And you brought them here." "I didn't know where else to take them," James said. "She needs time, needs to heal enough to keep moving. And the boy, he needs his mother to be okay." "That's a heavy burden you're taking on," Thomas observed. "These aren't your people, James. Aren't your problems." "I know," James said quietly. "But I keep thinking about Emma, about how I wasn't there when she needed me, how I let my own pride and stubbornness get in the way of being the father she deserved. And I look at that boy in there, and I see the same look in his eyes that I used to see in hers when she was small and scared and didn't understand why Daddy was always angry, always leaving. Maybe I can't fix what I broke with my own daughter, but maybe I can do something right here." Thomas didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was softer than before. "Redemption's a hard road, James, and it doesn't always end the way you hope it will." "I know," James said again, "but I have to try." Thomas nodded slowly, as if James had just confirmed something he had already suspected. "They can stay, long as they need. But you understand that if whoever she's running from comes looking, we might have to make hard choices." "I understand," James said, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. He wasn't sure what hard choices looked like when a child's safety was at stake, wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to protect people he had just met. But he knew that walking away now wasn't an option, that something fundamental had shifted inside him the moment Ethan had looked at him with those desperate eyes and whispered, "Mommy can't walk anymore." They stood together in the darkness, two men bound by the silent understanding that sometimes redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. Sometimes it was about showing up when you didn't have to, about offering shelter when the world had offered none, about believing that broken things could be mended even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Inside, through the window, James could see Ethan curled up on the couch, his small body finally relaxed in sleep. And in the guest room, Sarah rested, her breathing slow and steady, the tension finally draining from her features. For the first time in what was probably a very long time, they were safe. It might not last. Safety rarely did for people who were running. But for tonight, for this moment, it was enough. James stayed at the ranch that night, sleeping in a chair in the living room with one ear tuned to any sound that might signal distress. The hours passed slowly, marked by the ticking of an old clock on the mantel and the soft sounds of the house settling around him. And somewhere in those quiet hours, between wakefulness and sleep, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. When dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, James was already awake. He made coffee in Thomas's kitchen, the familiar ritual grounding him. And when Ethan wandered in with sleepy eyes and rumpled hair, James poured him a glass of orange juice and made him toast with butter and honey. "Is my mom okay?" Ethan asked, the same question he had asked the day before, the question that seemed to define his entire existence. "She's resting," James said, and this time it felt less like a lie. "Why don't you eat your breakfast, and then we can check on her together?" Ethan nodded and ate his toast in small, careful bites. And James watched him and wondered about the kind of life this child had lived, about the things he had seen and heard and learned to fear. No child should have to carry that kind of weight, should have to learn that the world was dangerous and that the people who were supposed to protect you could also be the ones you needed protection from. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, almost peaceful, though James knew better than to mistake temporary calm for permanent safety. Sarah spent most of her time resting, slowly regaining strength that had been depleted by months or maybe years of running in fear. Thomas brought her meals and asked no questions, treating her with the same gruff kindness he had once shown James. And gradually, the color began to return to her cheeks. The tremor began to fade from her hands. Ethan, meanwhile, discovered the ranch with the wide-eyed wonder of a child who had spent too much time in cars and cheap motel rooms. Thomas taught him how to feed the chickens, how to brush down the old mare who lived in the barn, how to identify different bird calls in the early morning. The boy absorbed it all with an eagerness that was heartbreaking in its intensity, as if he were trying to store up these moments of normalcy against a future that might snatch them away at any moment. James stayed because leaving felt impossible, because every time he thought about getting back in his truck and returning to his own life, he remembered the way Sarah had looked crumpled on that bathroom floor, the way Ethan had whispered those words that had started all of this. He told himself he would leave as soon as Sarah was well enough to make her own decisions, as soon as he was sure they had a plan that didn't involve breaking down on random highways and hoping for the kindness of strangers. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that for the first time in years, James felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that extended beyond his own small world of regret and loneliness. He felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with fixing engines or mending fences, and he found himself wanting to hold on to that feeling for just a little longer on the fourth day, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Sarah emerged from the house and found James sitting on the porch steps, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. She moved more easily now, with less of the careful fragility that had defined her movements before. And when she sat down beside him, there was a steadiness to her that hadn't been there before. "I owe you my life," she said without preamble. "Both of us do." James shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do," Sarah insisted. "You didn't have to stop. Didn't have to help. Most people wouldn't have. Most people aren't as broken as I am," James said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Most people haven't spent years running from their own failures." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. "His name is Derek, Ethan's father. We met when I was young and stupid and thought that love meant someone wanting to possess you completely. By the time I realized that possessiveness wasn't love, it was too late. I was pregnant, and Derek made it very clear that if I tried to leave, if I tried to take his son away from him, he would make sure I never saw Ethan again. He had connections, money, lawyers who could twist anything into proof that I was an unfit mother." James listened without interrupting, letting her words flow, understanding that this confession was something she needed to give voice to, something she had been carrying in silence for too long. "For years I stayed," Sarah continued. "I told myself I was doing it for Ethan, that a father, even a controlling, angry father, was better than no father at all. But then Derek's control started to turn into something darker. He started monitoring everything I did, everyone I talked to. He put cameras in the house, tracking apps on my phone. And he started teaching Ethan things, started telling him that women needed to be managed, needed to be kept in line. And I knew that if I didn't leave, if I didn't take Ethan away from that poison, my son would grow up to be exactly like his father. So you ran, James said. So I ran, Sarah confirmed. Took what cash I could hide away over months, grabbed Ethan in the middle of the night, and just drove. No plan, no destination. Just away. And Derek's been following ever since. I can feel it, James. Even when I don't see him, I know he's out there, tracking us down, getting closer. Because men like Derek don't let go. They don't forgive. They destroy what they can't control. James felt anger rise in his chest, hot and fierce, the kind of anger that came from recognizing a fundamental injustice in the world. You're safe here, he said. For now, at least. Thomas and I will make sure of that. Sarah turned to look at him, and there were tears in her eyes, but they were different from the tears he had seen before. These were tears of gratitude, mixed with something that looked almost like hope. Why are you doing this? She asked. Really, what do you get out of helping us? James thought about Emma, about the last conversation they had had before she stopped returning his calls. She had told him that he was good at showing up when it didn't matter and disappearing when it did, that she didn't need a father who treated parenting like a part-time job. He could quit whenever it got too hard. And he had gotten angry, had said things he shouldn't have, and when he tried to call back to apologize, she hadn't answered. That had been 2 years ago, and every day since, he had carried the weight of that silence. I have a daughter, James said finally. Had, I guess. She doesn't talk to me anymore. And I spent a long time telling myself that was her choice, that she was the one who walked away. But the truth is, I walked away first. I walked away 1,000 times in small ways. Missed recitals, forgotten birthdays, phone calls I was too tired to make. And by the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late to get it back. So maybe I'm helping you because I can't help her. Or maybe I'm helping you because it's the only way I know how to prove to myself that I'm not completely beyond redemption. Sarah reached over and placed her hand on top of his, a simple gesture that carried the weight of shared understanding. You're a good man, James Dalton, she said quietly. Better than you give yourself credit for. James didn't respond because he didn't believe it, couldn't believe it when the evidence of his failures was so clearly written in the years of silence between him and his daughter. But he let Sarah's hand rest on his, let himself accept the comfort, even if he couldn't accept the compliment, and together they sat and watched as the last of the daylight faded into darkness. That night, James dreamed of Emma. She was young again, maybe 7 or 8, and they were at a county fair. She was tugging on his hand, pulling him toward the carousel, her face bright with excitement. But when they got there, the carousel was broken, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes staring at nothing. And Emma looked up at him with such disappointment, such quiet resignation, and said, "It's okay, Daddy. I'm used to things being broken." He woke with a start, his heart pounding, and found that the sun was just beginning to rise. Through the window, he could see Ethan in the yard, practicing the lasso technique Thomas had been teaching him, his small face serious with concentration. And James watched him and thought about second chances, about how rare they were and how easy it was to waste them by not recognizing them when they came. Later that morning, as James was helping Thomas repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. They both stopped working and watched as a dark sedan turned onto the road leading to the ranch, moving too fast for a casual visitor, too deliberately for someone who was lost. Sarah said he'd come. Thomas said quietly, his hand moving to the truck where James knew he kept a rifle behind the seat. Get Sarah and Ethan into the root cellar, James said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. Don't let them come out until I give the all clear. Thomas nodded and moved quickly toward the house while James stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. He had no weapons, no plan beyond putting himself between whatever was coming and the people he had promised to protect. It wasn't smart, wasn't strategic, but it was the only thing he could think to do. The sedan pulled up and parked in a cloud of dust, and when the door opened, a man stepped out. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that suggested money and success, and he moved with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, from always getting what he wanted. This was Derek. James knew instinctively, knew it in the way the man's eyes scanned the property with a sense of ownership, knew it in the cold calculation of his expression. "I'm looking for my wife and son," Derek said, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone of steel. "I was told they might be here." "Don't know what you're talking about," James replied, keeping his stance relaxed but his muscles tense, ready. Derek smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you do. See, Sarah has a tendency to run away when things get difficult, and she has a habit of convincing well-meaning people to help her. But the thing is, she's not well. She needs medical attention, professional help. And Ethan needs to be with his father, where he belongs." Every word was carefully chosen, James realized, designed to sound reasonable, to paint Sarah as unstable and Derek as concerned. It was the kind of manipulation that worked in courtrooms and police stations, the kind that turned victims into villains and abusers into sympathetic figures. "If she's not well, then maybe you should respect her need for space," James said. "Maybe you should consider that running away from you was the healthiest thing she could do." Derek's expression hardened, the mask of concern slipping just enough to reveal the anger beneath. "You don't know anything about our situation. You don't know what she's taken from me, what she's putting our son through by dragging him around the country like some kind of fugitive. I know that she's terrified of you." James shot back. "I know that a child shouldn't look at the world with the kind of fear I see in Ethan's eyes. And I know that whatever you think you're owed, it doesn't include the right to hunt down a woman who wants nothing to do with you." For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Then Derek took a step forward, and James moved to meet him, positioning himself squarely in the other man's path. "You're making a mistake," Derek said softly, dangerously. "I have resources, connections. I can make your life very difficult." "My life's already difficult," James replied. "Been difficult for a long time. One more complication won't make much difference." They stood there in the morning sunlight, two men on opposite sides of a line that neither was willing to cross just yet. And James understood, in that moment, that this was the choice Thomas had warned him about, the hard decision that came with trying to protect people from the monsters that wore human faces. He understood that stepping aside, letting Derek take what he had come for, would be the easy path, the safe path. But some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds weren't in your favor. It was Thomas who broke the stalemate, emerging from the house with his rifle held loosely but visibly at his side. "I think you should leave," the old man said, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. Derek's eyes flicked to the rifle, and something in his expression shifted. Not fear, exactly, but a recalculation. "This isn't over," he said, looking back at James. "I'll find them. I always do. And when I do, you'll wish you had stayed out of it." He got back into his sedan and drove away, the tires spitting gravel as he accelerated back down the road. But James knew it was a temporary retreat, not a surrender. Men like Derek didn't give up. They regrouped, found new angles, new ways to apply pressure until their targets broke. Thomas lowered the rifle and walked over to stand beside James. "He'll be back," the old man said. "With the law? Maybe, or with people who aren't afraid of guns." "I know," James said. "Which means Sarah and Ethan can't stay here. It's not safe anymore." They found Sarah and Ethan in the root cellar, the woman holding her son close while he trembled against her. When James told her that Derek had come and gone, Sarah's face crumbled, and she began to cry. Not with fear, but with a kind of exhausted despair, as if this confirmation of what she had always known had finally broken through the last of her defenses. "We have to keep moving," she said through her tears. "We have to go now, before he comes back with—" "No," James interrupted gently. "You're not running anymore. Not like this." Sarah looked at him with confusion and disbelief. "What other choice do we have? He found us, James. He'll keep finding us no matter where we go." "Then we changed the game," James said, the plan forming even as he spoke. "We stop running away and start building something he can't tear down. We get you legal protection, we document everything, and we make sure that if he tries to take Ethan, the law is on your side instead of his." The law doesn't care about women like me, Sarah said bitterly. Derek has money, has lawyers who can twist anything. I've tried before, and every time, they make me look like I'm the problem. Maybe, James said, but you've never had witnesses before. You've never had people willing to testify about what they saw, about the fear in your eyes and the bruises on your soul, even if they don't show on your skin. Thomas and I will stand with you. And there are others, people who believe that no amount of money or connections gives someone the right to terrorize the person they claim to love. It was Thomas who spoke next, his voice carrying a weight of memory. My daughter ran from a man like that once, he said quietly. Ran for 3 years before she finally stopped running and faced him in court. It was the hardest thing she ever did, and it nearly broke her. But when it was over, when the judge finally saw him for what he was and granted her full custody of her kids, she told me it was the first time in her life she felt truly free. Not because the fear went away. Fear like that never completely leaves, but because she stopped letting it dictate her choices. Sarah looked between them, and James could see the war being waged behind her eyes, the desperate hope battling against years of defeat and disappointment. What if it doesn't work? She whispered. What if we try and he still wins? Then at least you tried, James said. At least Ethan will grow up knowing that his mother fought for him, that she didn't spend her whole life running. And that counts for something, Sarah. That counts for everything. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that comes before a decision, before a leap into unknown territory with no guarantee of soft landing. And then Sarah nodded, slowly at first, then with more certainty, and James saw something shift in her expression. Not confidence, exactly, but a kind of fierce determination that had been buried beneath layers of exhaustion and fear. Okay, she said. Okay, we fight. Over the following days, they began to build their case. Thomas knew a lawyer in a nearby town, a woman named Margaret Shun who specialized in domestic violence cases and had a reputation for taking on clients others wouldn't touch. Margaret drove out to the ranch and listened as Sarah told her story. Not the abbreviated version she had given James, but the full, painful truth of years spent under Derek's control, of incidents that had escalated from psychological manipulation to physical intimidation, of a justice system that had repeatedly failed to see the danger she was in. Margaret took notes, asked questions that made Sarah cry, and then apologize for crying, and then cry harder when Margaret told her she had nothing to apologize for. And when Sarah was done, when she had poured out every dark memory and shameful moment, Margaret looked her in the eye and said, "We can win this. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but we can win." James spent those days making calls, reaching out to people he hadn't spoken to in years, friends who might know someone, connections that might lead to more connections, building a network of support that extended beyond just good intentions. He called his ex-wife too, for the first time in 18 months, and when she answered, the surprise in her voice was almost painful. "James, is everything okay?" "Not really," he admitted, "but I'm trying to fix something, and I need to know, Emma, is she okay?" There was a pause, and he could hear the calculation in the silence, whether to tell him the truth or to protect him from it. "She's fine," his ex-wife finally said. "She's doing well in school, has a boyfriend, is thinking about colleges. She's fine, James. She doesn't know how to forgive you yet." "I don't need her to forgive me," James said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I just need her to know that I'm trying to be better, that I understand what I did wrong, and I'm trying to be the kind of person who doesn't make those mistakes anymore. I'll tell her," his ex-wife promised, and there was a softness in her voice that James hadn't heard in years. She should know that. When he hung up, James found Thomas watching him from the doorway. "Hard conversation?" the old man asked. "All the important ones are," James replied. They filed the restraining order against Derek 3 days later, presenting a case that included not just Sarah's testimony, but statements from James and Thomas, medical records that documented Sarah's declining health during her marriage, and photographs that Sarah had secretly taken over the years, images of bruises, of broken furniture, of Ethan hiding in a closet during one of Derek's rages. It was a catalog of abuse that was both overwhelming and heartbreaking, and when the judge reviewed it, his expression grew progressively graver. Derek fought it, of course. He brought his lawyers and his polished testimony, painted himself as a concerned husband driven to desperation by a wife who refused treatment for mental illness. But Margaret was prepared, and she systematically dismantled his narrative, exposing the inconsistencies, the convenient omissions, the way his version of events always positioned him as the victim and Sarah as the aggressor. And when Ethan was brought in for a private interview with a child psychologist, an interview that Derek's lawyers tried and failed to prevent, the boy's testimony was what finally turned the tide. He spoke quietly but clearly about his fear of his father, about the nights he spent hiding in his room when the yelling started, about the way his mother would smile and pretend everything was fine even when her hands were shaking and her eyes were red from crying. The judge granted the restraining order. He granted temporary full custody to Sarah, pending a more comprehensive hearing. And he made it very clear that any attempt by Derek to violate the order would result in immediate arrest and prosecution. When they left the courthouse, Sarah collapsed into James's arms and sobbed. Not with sadness, but with relief so profound it felt like a physical release, as if years of tension were finally draining away. Ethan held on to both of them, his small face pressed against his mother's side, and for the first time since James had met him, the boy's expression wasn't clouded with fear. "We did it," Sarah whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," James corrected gently. "You stood up and told the truth. That's what made the difference." They drove back to the ranch as the sun was setting, and Thomas had prepared a meal. Nothing fancy, just stew and cornbread, but it tasted like celebration. They ate together around the kitchen table, and the conversation was light, full of relief and the kind of fragile hope that comes after surviving something terrible. Later, after Ethan had been put to bed and Sarah had gone to rest, James sat on the porch with Thomas and watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "You did a good thing," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. "We did a good thing," James corrected. "Couldn't have done it without you." Thomas waved a hand dismissively. "I just provided space. You provided the will to stay when leaving would have been easier. That's what mattered." James thought about that, about all the times he had chosen leaving over staying, about how easy it had been to tell himself that his absence was justified, that his daughter would be fine without him, that he was doing everyone a favor by not burdening them with his presence. And he thought about how different these past weeks had been, how staying had felt like the hardest and most important thing he had ever done. "I'm going to call Emma," James said suddenly. "I'm going to keep calling until she answers, and then I'm going to tell her that I'm sorry. Not because I expect her to forgive me, but because she deserves to hear it. And then I'm going to figure out how to be in her life in whatever way she'll let me, even if that means starting from scratch, even if it takes years to rebuild what I broke." Thomas smiled, and it was the kind of smile that came from understanding, from having walked similar paths through similar darkness. Redemption's not a destination, James. It's a direction. You just have to keep walking toward it, even when you can't see where you're going. They sat together in the darkness, two men who had learned that being broken wasn't the same as being beyond repair, that the cracks in a person could let light in as well as out. And somewhere above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent and beautiful, witnesses to every human struggle and every quiet victory. Sarah and Ethan stayed at the ranch for another 2 weeks while the legal proceedings continued, while Sarah regained her strength and Ethan learned what it felt like to sleep without fear. James stayed too, not because he had to, but because he had discovered something in the act of staying. He had discovered that the hollow place inside him, the void that had been there since Emma stopped taking his calls, was beginning to fill with something that felt almost like purpose. On the morning they finally prepared to leave, Sarah had found a job in a nearby town, a small apartment that was within her budget, a fresh start that didn't require running. James helped them load their few belongings into a car that Thomas had helped Sarah purchase with money saved from years of budgeting and sacrifice. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. Ethan hugged James tightly, his small arms wrapping around the man's waist with surprising strength. "Thank you for saving us," the boy whispered. James knelt down, so they were eye to eye. "You saved yourselves," he said. "I just helped you remember that you could." Sarah embraced him next, and her hug lasted longer, carried more weight. "I don't know what we would have done without you," she said. "You gave us more than shelter, James. You gave us a chance to believe that people could be good, that not everyone would turn away. You gave me something too," James replied. "You reminded me what it means to show up, to stay when things get hard. That's a lesson I needed to learn." They drove away as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and James stood in the yard watching until the car disappeared over the horizon. Thomas came to stand beside him, and together they watched the dust settle back onto the road. "You gonna stay?" Thomas asked. "For a while," James said, "if that's all right with you. I need to make some calls, need to figure out how to be the kind of father my daughter deserves, even if I can't turn back time. And I think I need to do that from a place that reminds me what I'm working toward." Thomas nodded. "Stay as long as you need. This place has always been about second chances. No reason it can't offer you one too." That evening, as the light began to fade and the world softened into shades of blue and purple, James sat on the porch with his phone in his hand. He had dialed Emma's number 3 times already and hung up before it could ring. But this time, he let it connect. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and he was about to give up when he heard her voice. "Hello." She sounded older, more mature than the last time they had spoken, and James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Emma," he said quietly, "it's your dad. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, and I don't blame you. But I need you to know something. I need you to know that I'm sorry, not just for the big things, but for all the small ways I failed you, all the moments I should have been there and wasn't. And I need you to know that I'm working on being better, on being the kind of person who shows up and stays, who doesn't make excuses or run away when things get difficult." There was silence on the other end, and James waited, his heart pounding, prepared for her to hang up, to tell him it was too late, that sorry wasn't enough. But instead, she spoke, and her voice was small and uncertain, but not unkind. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Dad. It still hurts too much." "I know," James said, "and I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I mean what I say, to show you through actions instead of words that I can be better. Even if that takes years. Even if it never gets back to what it was before." Another silence, longer this time, filled with the weight of years and unspoken pain. And then, "Maybe we could talk sometimes. Just start slow. See how it goes." James closed his eyes, and the relief that washed over him was so intense it was almost physical. "I'd like that. I like that very much." They talked for another 10 minutes, carefully, tentatively, like 2 people learning to walk across ice that might crack at any moment. But it was a beginning, and that was more than James had dared to hope for. When they finally said goodbye, and he hung up, he sat for a long time in the gathering darkness, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. The quiet certainty that tomorrow might be better than today, that the direction he was walking in was finally the right one. Thomas found him there later, brought him a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm in the night air. "How'd it go?" the old man asked. "Better than I deserved," James replied honestly. "But maybe that's what grace is, getting better than you deserve and being given a chance to earn it anyway." "Maybe so," Thomas agreed, settling into the chair beside him. "Maybe that's what all of us are doing out here, earning the grace we've been given, trying to become worthy of the second chances we didn't think we'd get." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one overhead, as the night deepened and the world grew quiet around them. And in that silence, James understood something fundamental about redemption. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the broken things were whole. It was about accepting the cracks and learning to build something new from the pieces that remained. It was about showing up day after day, even when you didn't know if it would make a difference, even when the outcome was uncertain. Sarah and Ethan were safe now, building a life free from fear. Emma had answered his call, had given him the smallest opening to prove he could change. And James was here, in this place called redemption, learning what that word really meant. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, days when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But James had learned that transformation wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small choices to stay instead of run, to face instead of hide, to keep walking toward the light even when the darkness felt overwhelming. And as he sat there under the vast Texas sky, with the cool night air on his skin and the weight of possibility in his heart, James Dalton understood that he was finally, truly, on his way home. Not to a place, but to the person he had always been capable of becoming, if only he had had the courage to try. The boy had whispered, "Mommy can't walk anymore." And in responding to that simple, heartbreaking plea, James had discovered that sometimes saving someone else was the first step towards saving yourself. That sometimes the greatest acts of courage didn't look heroic from the outside. They looked like an old cowboy pulling over on a dusty highway and deciding that this time, this moment, he would be the person who stayed. And in the end, that decision had changed all their lives. Not because it solved everything, not because it erased the pain or made the future certain, but because it reminded them all that even in a world full of cruelty and indifference, there were still people who would stop, who would see suffering and respond with kindness, who would offer shelter to the lost and hope to the broken. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, uncaring and eternal. But down below, in the small illuminated circle of the porch light, 3 lives have been irrevocably altered by the simple act of one person choosing compassion over convenience, connection over isolation. And that, perhaps, was the truest form of redemption. Not grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but the quiet, persistent choice to be better today than you were yesterday, to show up for others even when you were still learning how to show up for yourself. The night deepened. The coffee grew cold. And James Dalton sat in the darkness, no longer running from his past, but finally walking toward his future.